Our guests today are Kyoko Takahashi Lin, a partner of Davis Polk up in New York, and Laura Heiman, Chief Counsel, Executive Compensation of McKesson Corporation. Kyoko's been a mainstay of the proxy season conference that I ran for many years and a wonderful dear friend. And Laura, I've also known forever. She lives in one of my favorite places in the world, San Francisco, right by the bay. I'm jealous. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point. What are common mistakes or pitfalls that people should look to avoid?
I think that people forget that that compensation comes in many different forms and ways, and they're gonna, everyone's gonna think of the obvious forms of compensation like salary and annual bonus and equity awards and things like that. But especially in the all other compensation column, where there's a lot of sort of little bits and pieces of compensation, people just might forget it. And oftentimes, the people who are preparing this disclosure are not the same people who know about the little bits and pieces of compensation that are out there, actually. So, it's only through a process does that even come out. And so that, that can happen. It's probably not a big point, but it's not uncommon for that to happen. So really having good controls over all the different elements of your compensation, and also really making sure that all the people who touch compensation and benefits, whether it's in legal, compliance, certainly HR, finance, that they're really coordinating is probably the best way to make sure that, all of that is coming together. Laura, you may have some additional thoughts, obviously, based on your role within your company.
Right. I mean, I agree with everything you said. I mean, it's, from the practical perspective, you should reach out early. I mentioned before doing a careful inventory of all of the potential plans and programs. Reach out early to the people from whom you're going to get this information after the end of the fiscal year. You simply can't get it earlier than that because all of this is fiscal year end based, right? But you're going to have several people in an HR organization, the people who administer your pension plan, who administer your 401k non-qualified deferred comp plans. You're going to need to talk to them. If you have corporate jets, there's probably a group that manages the corporate jet flights and the requests and is doing all sorts of calculations for tax purposes and other purposes. You need to make sure that they know that there's a proxy calculation that needs to be done too for personal use of corporate jets. At my company, that's a securities section. So they're completely outside HR. Your finance teams, you'll need to be talking with the people who do your equity accounting. Get in touch with them early because at the end of the fiscal year, they're all going to be super busy doing other stuff. And you just need to keep educating them about what it is you need, remind them, and then you have to start nagging them after the end of the fiscal year. That's very important. But it's a process of education from within the company as to what it is you need.
I think another thing that we see is the disclosure on equity compensation. The rules are very detailed. As I mentioned, they're accounting driven for purposes of the summary compensation table. And what you report in terms of equity, it actually flows through the other tables that we haven't talked about in this session, but there's the grants of plan-based awards table, there's the outstanding equity awards table, there's the stock vested and option exercise table, there's a lot of other tables. And so just really remembering that all these different tables actually have to hang together is really important to understand. And from a quality control perspective, just make sure that you're saying the same thing. This is particularly true, for example, if an equity award is modified in the course of the year for whatever reason. And this might particularly be true for this year, just given the possibility that companies may be modifying their equity awards. Just making sure that you track that through not just the summary compensation table, but all the other tables too, and make sure that your disclosure is consistent is going to be very important. And because the rules are so granular and particular, just really making sure that you do a close compliance check of that is just an important thing to do.
One small thing that is such a headache to deal with, but this is in terms of tax gross ups. There are other payments that are making people whole for tax issues that you might not think of as a gross up, but keep in mind, if you happen to have executive officers who are expatriates, who are living elsewhere, companies commonly have expats benefits programs, which involve, they're enormously complicated, but which may involve extra payments to those executives to make them whole for the tax consequences of living in a higher tax zone. Those are gross ups, and you need to talk about them. To be sure, a lot of investors don't really, they understand that they are very expensive, but it could really, the cost of doing those kinds of programs could really jack up your all other compensation. So you need to keep an eye on that too. One other thing from just purely practical matter of making sure your numbers are correct, we use SharePoint, but we have a SharePoint site and instruct everyone to load their backup to the SharePoint site. And we have people from our financial reporting group go through and recheck numbers that have already been proofed a couple of times, and they go through the backup and check them again. And I think that's something from a practical perspective that you really got to set up. It's invaluable. When preparing your footnotes for the summary compensation table, remember that you only have to do footnotes for the most recently completed fiscal year and not for all of them.
And I think one last point that we might just make about perks, recognizing that there are a number of other sessions on perks already. Perk disclosure can be tricky. It's not always easy to know what's a perk and what's not a perk. It can be also very sensitive, both to the company and to the individuals involved. And so, just making sure that you have a good handle on the perks, as Laura mentioned before, is really important. And I think one last broader point that I would make, remember that at the end of the day, all the information that's in the summary compensation table and the footnotes accompanying the summary compensation table, these are about real people. These are your executive officers. This is their personal information that the SEC requires to be disclosed. And so just being really sensitive about that and understanding, for example, who can see the documents at what time and what can be shared and what can be discussed. How do you frame something, especially again if something is particularly sensitive? Thinking about, is there a way to try to make the item of compensation as explainable as possible to investors, the proxy advisory firms, whether it's the amount or the form of compensation, and your other stakeholders like your employees. Just being really thoughtful and sensitive about that is really key. And even if your compensation programs have not changed, looking at it with a fresh set of eyes and just remembering that, many, many people's eyes will be on this compensation disclosure. Again, just coming back to the point that the summary compensation table, because it chronologically comes up first, but also because it so neatly wraps up in a bow a person's total compensation, just really remembering that is, going to be looked at. It's so important to remember. And again, this is not just corporate disclosure. Like, this is disclosure about, a person's, compensation for the year. And so just remembering that, keeping that in mind as you're thinking about the preparation of the compensation and ultimately the disclosure that it goes, as it goes into an SEC filing is just something to remind yourself of, frequently.
Yeah, that's a great point. I have a separate Vid-Guide about usability of disclosure in plain English. And it's, if you have a colleague that's not in your field, but that can be read in, there's nothing material in the disclosure, you have them review a draft of your disclosure, and can they understand it? Can they comprehend what you're talking about? Is it too much of legalese, or did you just assume some knowledge on behalf of a typical reader? And you'll find out, from someone that isn't in your field more easily than if you have a colleague read it who does the same kind of work that you do.
I think that's a really good point.
So thank you so much, Kyoko and Laura. That was awesome. I learned some things. It's really good.
I don't know about that, Brock. You've said this many times,
Common
but
mistakes.
kind of you to say so.
Yes, I agree. Thanks for doing these. I think it's great. And Kyoko had lots of super great technical information. Last point is, call your outside lawyers. That's how you avoid mistakes too.
That's great.
Make sure you're having your outside counsel review and do a rules check. For heaven's sakes, don't forget that step.
So, well, thanks, Laura, for all your thoughts. It was, fun to put this together.